Hi, I'm taking a slightly different approach today to this video because I really want to talk to you about inspecting unusual swords, including curved swords. And well, as many swords as I have here, I don't have that many that are curved or super unusual. And so I solicited pictures from people on the internet. Thanks to the magic of the Book of Faces, I've got a bunch of examples here to show you. So let's get right into it. All right, so this sword, I'm starting out with something that's not entirely curved. In fact, you can see that it fits inside a straight PVC pipe. This sword looks curved, but is really rather straight, especially on the back edge. Now we're getting into slightly more curved swords. Nothing super unusual about this sword. Remember that the blade length is measured from right here at the front of the keons, in this case it would be right here, to the end of the sword. Moving on, another sword, not all that unusual, and you can see the relative lengths of this sword. Now we're getting into slightly more curved swords, and yet more curved. Now I want you to start noticing that the handles on some of these swords are going to be a little bit more decorative than the standard rapier, a little bit more curved with other special features in them. All right, another sword here. Keep in mind that in our new rule set, we don't have the rule anymore where the handle length is limited to being 1/3 of the length of the overall sword. This sword still would have passed under the old rule set, but do keep that in mind as you're inspecting these swords. All right, now we're starting to get into ever more curved swords, a little bit different type of handle and guard than perhaps we're seeing on a typical swept hilt. So something to keep in mind here when you're inspecting this type of sword is, this feature here that stands out from the main part of the guard is that presenting a sharp point to an opponent. Is this starting to separate from the sword so that it can be potentially an issue to catch an arm or a blade in between it and the sword? Overall, this sword looks in very good shape. I would pass this sword, given that it passes the flex test. All right, same here. We start to see this type of feature a little more. We start to see a slightly different type of guard, but as long as this isn't sharp, it's not presenting any danger to the opponent. Yet another type of sword, now we're starting to see this type of hooked handle in use, right? This is going to be tucked behind the person's hand, and so this doesn't present any issue to the opponent. Same thing, a little bit more of a curve, same thing with the hook there on the handle. All right, now this type of sword, once again, we're starting to see a little bit more decoration. And so one might say, well, on this sword, what are the things to look for? Where does the sword start? I would say that the sword really starts right here where this metal starts. We measure the sword from the location that makes it an effective blade length. In this case, sure, there's this decoration so that one could argue, well, the bladed part of the sword doesn't start till here. Yeah, but you don't hold the sword from here. You hold the sword from the handle, from this wooden component, and so it's measured from this point here. Once again, these swords perfectly pass, but they're really good examples to show you some of these things to think about when you're inspecting these swords. All right, here's another sword, which clearly passes in terms of length, in terms of curvature. One thing to keep in mind is, when you start to see this type of feature here, do watch for that, because that can be a place that easily picks up nicks and burrs. So make sure it's not sharp, that it's not going to injure anyone accidentally by sort of hooking their clothing or their skin. All right, I've mentioned this in passing in the previous slides, but one thing to keep in mind is the curve of the blade can't be so extreme that if you hold a blade with the handle vertically, that the thing that touches the ground isn't the tip. If you're ever really in doubt, how can you check that the handle is positioned vertically? Well, hopefully you've got a little weight in your kit to measure the flex of swords. And if you give yourself a little bit more rope, a little bit something flexible, you can use that as a plumb so that you have a vertical with you wherever you go. And the other thing to keep in mind, handles themselves are to be substantially straight. Those hooks that we saw before, that's just a pommel, right? The handle itself is substantially straight and substantially in line with the main axis of the blade. Handles are supposed to be substantially straight and substantially in line with the main axis of the blade. What we're talking about there is we don't want to have a spade handle. We don't want to have a punch dagger. We want to hold the sword sort of with the wrist a little bit bent in order for the sword to be aiming mostly at the opponent. So when you're looking at something like this, right, this is a fairly curved sword. Would this pass? Well, yes, it would. So the long red line there is a line that would be in line with the handle. And if you hold that vertically, then the ground would be perpendicular to that. And as you can see by the short red line, the thing that touches the ground there is the tip. It's not the sword itself. And also, I would say that this yellow line kind of is the axis of the sword, and that's largely in line with the handle. Once again, what we're really trying to avoid here is a handle that's mostly perpendicular to the sword, to the way that the sword is going to be used. And certainly this sword passes both in the letter and the spirit of the law. Now this sword certainly doesn't look all that unusual. It's got a curve, but it's not a huge curve. So why did I bring this sword here? Because, well, this video isn't just about curved swords, it's also about slightly unusual swords. So something to keep in mind. Notice that there's a big cup hilt on this sword. Well, take a look inside the cup hilt to take a look at the handle to see where the actual blade length needs to be measured from. So in this case, sure enough, on the inside, they have a false ricasso. They've got the keons, and per our rules, the blade length starts at the leading edge of those keons. So in this case, to measure this sword, you need to measure it from the leading edge of the keons. You might have to do it in two parts. You might have to measure the false ricasso and then measure the rest of this sword. This sword is perfectly fine. It's perfectly within our bounds. All right, next sword. Well, certainly it doesn't look too unusual from this angle, but look at this other angle. Certainly that bow there is something that most of us don't see too often. So how would you measure the length of this sword? Well, fairly straightforward, from the leading edge of those keons. All right, now moving on to swords that have more than one curve, because certainly we see this type of sword. I've seen this type of sword a handful of times around the known world, and our rule states blades are to have at most one substantial curve. Oh no, what about this sword? No, this sword is fine. What that rule is there for is to maintain the mechanics of how we do sword fighting. Our swords are meant to be essentially thrust weapons and slashing weapons, percussive hits, cuts, tip cuts, draw cuts, push cuts, that sort of hit. They are not meant to be hooks for grabbing onto someone and pulling them, or so hugely curved or S-curved in a very, very pronounced way, such that the hit is going to come in from the side while the sword seems like it's moving forward. And this sword, I would argue, is in fact substantially straight. And these curves don't rise to the occasion of these substantial curves that would obviate the use of this sword in the standard way. So this type of sword, no, that curve is too excessive, and it does not pass our test of a line through the handle held vertically. What contacts the ground in this case isn't going to be that tip, it's going to be the sword. So this type of sword would not be allowed. Certainly not this type of sword. Sure, in this case, actually, those handles are substantially in line with the sword, but look at that massive curve. This sword is not meant to be a thrusting or percussive percussive cut, pardon me, type of weapon. This sword is meant for slashing and for pulling, and that is not the game that we are simulating. And so this type of weapon, even if that end was not so sharp and it was properly tipped, would not be allowed in our game. And I'm just going to end right there on the flamberge, which absolutely meets our rule set as long as it is properly tipped, meets all the flex requirements, all the length requirements, etc. Having multiple waves along a single axis is perfectly allowed in our sport. Thank you.